I'd like to ask Mr. Paul to come up right now and to introduce our guest speaker, Ms. Robinson.
Thank you, Barry. I have an opportunity to introduce our next speaker from Nova Scotia, Viola Robinson. She's a well-known person from our communities in Nova Scotia. She most recently got the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada, as well as QC. And she's been an inspiring leader in Nova Scotia for decades, I'd say, in terms of the time she's been around. And she's worked on many issues, including discrimination in the Indian Act, and advocated on behalf of Aboriginal women in this region and other parts of Canada. She served as the president of the Native Council of Nova Scotia between 1975 and 1990, and the president of Native Council of Canada 1990 to 91. And she was one of 7 commissions on the Royal Commission of Aboriginal People that basically went across the country and talked to almost everybody and anybody about coming up with a plan for the future. And, you know, I'm sure she has some insights about the commission and how not all the recommendations were actually executed. And, you know, having received an honorary degree, Doctorate of Laws from Dalhousie, she went on to study, and now she's the Senior Mi'kmaq Advisor on the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, and now the lead negotiator for the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, and continues to bring her wisdom, persistence, vision, and her kindness to the work she does with our communities and with our chiefs across Nova Scotia and across Atlantic Canada and everywhere else. With that, Viola, if I can ask you to come up to the front.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm going to welcome you to this conference as a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia to our territory, for those of you who don't belong here. And I want to thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. And to tell you, I just got the invitation a few days ago. And then I thought, oh my goodness. And this change that has just was announced last week, I think, or a week before, just shortly, about the Indian Act is quite profound. And it's one of the recommendations by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And I thought, well, I better dig my report out and I better start looking to see what we said. And so I did that quickly, and then I got thinking about really what to say, and I did make a few. I'm not going to follow my notes that much, but I did bring, I'll tell you, I do have my recommendations, because I may want to make reference to them. I want to also say that I was listening this morning to all the speakers and really impressed and I think very encouraged by what I heard. And it's not to say that I'm not aware of what's going on. There's been, in 20 years since this report was published, and to where we are today, 20 years later, I have seen a lot of progress being made. There are some recommendations that have been implemented, I guess, by the governments. And the recommendations didn't deal with just federal government. They deal with provincial governments too. And it dealt with corporations, and it dealt with all of Canadian society. Because when we talk about a new relationship or a relationship between Canadians and Indigenous people in this country, we're talking about everybody. And the state of affairs for Aboriginal people and Indigenous people in this country is not all because of the Indian Act. It's because of a lot of other things. So the relationship has to come from the bottom up, and it has to be rebuilt throughout the whole nation of the country, between Indigenous people and between and the governments, all governments. And we always said that these recommendations from the Royal Commission was like, I call them a roadmap. The government calls them a blueprint. Call them what you may, they're there to follow. I have been working in the last 20 years since I left the Royal Commission, and everything I've done, I've always made reference to the report, what we said and what we heard. And right now, in my work in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq, we are working. This is the background. This is the grounding for me, is what we heard and what is in the report. And there were some profound recommendations, and I think one of them was just probably done with the change to the Indian Act. We knew there was not a place, hardly, I don't know, I forget. You've got a very good, I was reading this morning, somebody wrote one of the papers there, which outlines the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and I looked in that, and then it covered a lot of details about it, about how many recommendations were made and where all the places that were visited and the mandate and such. But everywhere we went, except the Inuit and the Métis, of course, but every First Nation community, they had nothing good to say about the Indian Act. Everybody said, get rid of it, get rid of it. It wasn't not just tinkering, not just changing it the way it's been, not the way it was done now, get rid of it. And we kept saying, well, really? Do you really want to get rid of the Indian Act? And if you do, what's going to replace it? What's going to be your relationship with the Government of Canada? The Government of Canada has a fiduciary responsibility for you as First Nations in this country. And they have to have a ways and means of implementing that fiduciary responsibility. What would you propose? Nobody had any answers. But I'll tell you, what's happening now and what I hear is that the answers have to come from us. It is us, the Indigenous people in this country. We have to decide. We have to stop relying on policies and other governments in writing and telling and directing on how we should move forward. The first thing, I'm just going to break my train of thought for a second, because when I was looking and I see that wealth creation, I don't like that word. Wealth. Really, I think we're better suited to independence. We need to be independent. We need to be, I wrote down some things what I thought, empowered, empowerment. And I think a lot of the things that's happening now, what you're doing here, what's going on in other forums, all the messages that are coming from the federal leadership, provincial leadership, I think are all about empowerment. We have to be empowered so we can really take our rightful place in this country. I remember the late Chief Justice Dixon, when we met with him when this when this was announced, and he laid out the mandate. I forget exactly how many things he laid out there for the mandate, but it was a lot. It was everything, about everything and all Indigenous people in the country. And one of the things that he said that we had to do, that he stressed, was education. Now, sometimes we as Indigenous people look at other things. We don't set education as a priority. We don't look at education as being the most important thing that we need to stress in our lives and in our families and in our nations. But he said it's so important to make sure that something is put in there about education and about the new relationship. To begin a new relationship, it's really important for all governments, federal, provincial, territorial, to acknowledge concepts such as terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, that they are factually, legally, and morally wrong. As one commissioner put it, they're lies. And that has to be corrected. And when we talked about a new proclamation, it's not to replace the existing proclamation of 1763, but in addition to that. And that will come one day. That will come one day when Indigenous people really get to the point where something of real substance is happening for our future. We're in the place where we're supposed to be. And the other thing was, we need to be an order of government in this country. There are 2 orders of government, but we need the 3rd one, and that's us. And the other thing was that we need to have, we said, maybe a parliament, Aboriginal parliament in Ottawa. And when we reach that, then it will be time to have the proclamation that we talked about and accompanying legislation for each province to enact. So anything that is, there is a duty not only for federal government, but there is a duty for provincial government to enact legislation that supports the legislation, any legislation that is being entered into by the federal government, legislated. It's in this province. I want to talk. I can't get away without talking about what's happening in our province in Nova Scotia as Mi'kmaq people. And we talked a lot about governance, and we said governance has to be, you can't have governance. For example, we have over 600 bands in this country, and you can't have that many agreements for self-government and manage them and be administered properly. And the people didn't want that. The people told us, we know who we are nations, we always were, we never, and that's what we want to be. And the recommendation was in order to have self-government, a true good government, you need to have it with a nation. Now, there are quite a few nations in Canada, Indigenous nations or First Nations. Nations, I mean, like, for example, the Mi'kmaq, or Cree, or whatever. There's a whole number of them. Those have to come back, and those are the entities of Indigenous people that can govern themselves as a nation. That was, and when I come back here and I think about the work we're doing here in this province as Mi'kmaq people, that our chiefs is a governing body. And the other thing I will say about Royal Commission recommendations or policies of the federal government or of any government, I think that with anything like that, it is really, the onus is on the people to work at implementing a lot of those recommendations. We need to do the work ourselves. We need to tell the government on how it has to be done. The day for government to start writing policies, and of course, I guess they can't work without policies, but at least making decisions about how we do this, or how we do that, or how we manage this, or whatever, is long gone. You have the RCAP, these 443 recommendations, they deal with everything. Land, governance structures like you have here, I mean economic structures, finance, taxes, everything. It's all here. You had the TRC report that built on this report, and you have all of those recommendations. And some of them are but what are a little bit repetitive, but nevertheless, it adds to the recommendations that we made here. What they're saying is that no matter how many times you go out with a commission or hearings, you're going to hear the same thing. You're going to hear the same thing. So you'll get recommendations again, and they will say the same thing, as this one said, as TRC said. Then you also have the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. We have that. How does that get implemented? So it's time to take that stuff and empower ourselves as a people, as a nations in this country, and use that stuff. And it's time for us to get together and work with the federal government, provincial government, and municipality or corporations, and start telling them how those things need to be implemented, because we are partners. We are partners with, and when I hear things like, when I hear terminology, like I heard a lot of it this morning, a lot of it is here, that is really, really encouraging for me. For example, where did I make my notes? I'm not following my notes, as you can see, because I hardly ever do. But anyway, when you hear things like self-determination, now, we would not have said that 20 years ago. We said it in the report. We said, we have self-determination as nations, as Indigenous Aboriginal nations in Canada. We have the power of self-determination. And with that self-determination, we can determine what our self-governance is. We can determine all of the things that we want to do, that we have that right. And so we need to do that. That's what we need to do. And I think there's been a lot of work done, and there's been a lot of work done by Indigenous peoples that really speaks to on how things should emerge and evolve from where we've been and where we're going and how we want to get there. And I think there's a window of opportunity with the federal government and not all provincial governments, but for some of them in this province, we are very fortunate. They do listen. They are working with us. That's why we're making improvements. That's why we're advancing. And to work together and sit down together and to determine all of these important things that has to happen in our lives and how we're going to move forward. Partnerships, that was never, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, no company or corporation would look at a First Nation and think about partnerships. Today, they are thinking about it. And they're starting to talk to our First Nations about partnerships. In Nova Scotia, it's a small province. We're all Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. That we're lucky for that. We're working together, which is very, very important, that no matter where Indigenous First Nations are, they have to work together. They have to help each other. We're working together, and one of the things that is required when you're talking about, because I'm the lead negotiator, talking about land, we have none. Because all we have in this province, it's a small province, it's Crown land, some of it, and then all this private land, and it's all taken up. And it's not only that, but the resources. You need resources. That's all taken up. And why I'm alluding to land and resources in Nova Scotia is because we come from a different, it's a little bit different than the rest of Canada, not only in Nova Scotia, but Atlantic Canada. We are working, negotiating on implementing rights. We have rights. We have treaty rights, pre-Confederation treaty rights, and their friendship treaties. They survived the land issue. There was never any cession of land. So really, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia own the province of Nova Scotia because they never gave anything up. There is a way the governments were to take land if they wanted land, and it was exercised in other areas. That's why you have treaties, post-Confederation treaties. It wasn't exercised here because they didn't have a way. They just took it. But we have pre-Confederation treaties that we agreed between two parties, the Crown then and the Mi'kmaq, to share the land and to live together here in peace. We lived together in peace, but not much was shared, at least not with us. So these are all legal things that, that where we're coming from, and that's part of all my negotiation as a negotiator, that we're talking about. How do we in Nova Scotia? So we are dealing with that, and we've made progress. We are accessing land. We are getting land, and we are people. It takes a lot of education. When the late Chief Brian Dixon said, educate, that's what he was talking about. Canadians don't know how to treat or how to work with Indigenous people if they don't know their history. If they don't know, all they know, the Indian Act is there. If there's a problem, if there's something, go there. They're there to fix it. It's not like that anymore. And I think with the changes that have just been made are going to, hopefully, that are going to help to work out some of these visions that we have as Indigenous people in this country that will allow us to move further in the way that we want to go. But I think the most important thing of all is that to make sure that we never fail to recognize like who we are as a nation, why we're here and what we're doing, and that the governments we are hearing words like recognition, self-determination, you're hearing about nation-to-nation dialogue. There's a lot of powerful, powerful words that are coming out of the governments. The Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice, they set out the 10 principles, which are good. They set out a cabinet ministerial, which is okay, but what are they going to do? What are they going to do about it? That's our job. That's our job as Indigenous people to figure that one out and to be able to say, this is where we are. We're equals now in this country. You're sitting over, when I sit at the table with the federal and provincial counterparts, I don't sit there as somebody on the side. I let them know we're equal here. And I deserve equal treatment. We're equal. We're all on the same level. And it's time that we took that. And it won't come to you. They won't put it on your lap. They won't pass it to you. You have to take it. And it's time for that. And the door is open for that. You got all these reports. You've got this report, you've got the TRC report, you've got the UNDRIP, you've got different groups of organizations and all kinds of leadership. We've got education, as we can, you know, when we go to meetings, we hear our people talking up there. Everybody's getting well educated, understanding. We have lawyers and we have all kinds of people. It's time that we sat down and we said, okay, this is we're equals now. And I don't know what else I can say that, you know, that can just really impress upon people how important it is to work together, work as partners, recognition, responsibility. And I think what we used to say in RCAP, which was recognition, the first thing we need to do is to be recognized for who and what we are and who we are. And respect, that has to be respected. And I guess reconciliation, that's the buzzword now, reconciliation, reconciling. Well, we're a full partner in that. And we have to make sure that's who we are and what we do. And as far as nation building, yes, we do have a job to do. Because we've been torn apart by the Indian Act with all these different categories of Indians in this country. We're nations. We need to go back and we need to sit down and figure out ourselves who we are. And we're doing that in this province. We've been doing it for 7 years. Working, and we're getting there. But we can't wait for governments to come and say, this is how you do it. And this is the bill that's going to allow you to do it. You just do it. Same with our governance structure we have here with our Assembly of Nova Scotia Chiefs. We're not waiting for any agreements or any governments to tell us how to do it. We're just doing it. And they are administering, and they were using their powers to do and enact things that is the best for their people in their communities in this province. That's governance. That's what it is. And until people do that, we'll be stuck for a while. Because you can get all the nice words, you can get all the nice things that they'll keep throwing out, and this is how we're going to do it, or whatever, but we have to be very proactive. And I'm only speaking from here as a Mi'kmaq person in Nova Scotia, and we're just all Mi'kmaq here, and we're small, but other nations have to do it. And there's a lot of us in this country, and everybody, and it can't all be the same. Blanket policies don't work for anybody or for anything in any country. Some things may work, but for the most part, things what we do in Nova Scotia and what they do in Ontario and what they do in Quebec and what they do in Manitoba or BC, we're all different. Where we live and who we live with is different. Even the provinces, you know, they're all different. Some governments won't acknowledge, they don't want to have anything to do with the Aboriginal people in their province. Your federal government, go work with them. But you have to push. We're doing it here. Because who has jurisdiction for everything you want to do in the province? Not the federal government, it's the provincial government. They have jurisdiction over all the land here. They have jurisdiction over just about resources. They have jurisdiction over everything except for fish. DFO has that, and DFO has federal government has parks, Canada, and we got 2 major parks here. So the biggest chunk of work that we do and talk about is with the province of Nova Scotia. So they can't say we do not have responsibility. We said in the commission report, provincial governments have and territorial governments have as much responsibility to be working and dealing with Indigenous peoples in their provinces as the federal government. If legislation gets enacted in federal government, then provincial governments have to put in legislation to support that. So it's changes, and there's a lot of work to be done. I say this is a window of opportunity, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not easy, but we have to take that responsibility as Indigenous people to make sure that we do it, and we can do it. It can be done. Not without its problems, but that's okay. Everybody doesn't think alike. I mean, look at the Canadian government within itself, or any level of government. It has its glitches, it has things that it has to overcome, but that's okay. And, but I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by the movement within our own Indigenous populations, and I'm encouraged with the movement in the federal government with, you know, after 20 years when they said, when this report was done, everybody was saying, oh no, not another report, oh my God, you know, well, it's just going to sit up there on a shelf and it's going to gather dust, that's it, forgotten about. And for a while I thought the same thing. But then 20 years rolled around, and last fall we had a review in Winnipeg, and all commissioners, we all went, and others were there. Some of you may have been there, and had a review. It was good. And, but now, 20 years later, now they come out with this. And it's dusted off. It's alive. It's still alive. It's always alive for me because I use it all the time. I have it. When I went to law school, that's what got me through. It was that. It was Because when you go from one end of the country to the other end of the country, and you listen to Indian, you listen to Inuit, and you listen to Métis, the off-reserve, and the urban, you listen to everybody, and then you listen to the public at large, and everybody's telling you what's wrong and what's right and what needs to be done, and we listened and listened and listened. And for 5 years, and we came up with 443 recommendations, and what we did was those recommendations is exactly what we heard. Now the government has to read and take heed and do what the recommendations are recommending. We listened, they have to listen. I often tell them that myself. I always say, just listen. Listen to what people are telling you. We do know what we're talking about. And we do know what's best for us. And we do know how to get there. So, it's the time for somebody telling us what to do and how to do it. And I'm hoping with this new structure, things will start to change. It will be a better way for everybody to move forward than using the old structure as it was. It's a beginning, it's a change. Who knows? They may restructure again. We may say, oh, this is not working. We have to do it this way. And if that's it, then so be it. That's what has to happen. Anyway, I want to thank you for allowing me to come and speak with you, and and the good work that's going on, and as far as I know what this is all about. When I hear people talking this morning and about governance, there's just so much to it. Self-government, governance. Of course you got to sustain yourself. How are you going to sustain yourself? You know, that's the big question. And I think that's what this is all about. You're trying to figure it out. Well, there's partnerships. Everybody else is sustaining themselves out there. Why can't we? All we need to be is a piece of the action. And then with the work that I'm doing, you know, we fell far behind in this province. It's not a rich province, mind you, but it's enough to keep the province going. So we're a part of that. We have a share in that, and that's where my fight is now. So that'll be another thing. So anyway.
Is it okay to ask some questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Questions?
Ms. Robinson, my name is Michael Collins, and I work for the department formerly known as INAC. Not quite sure where I work right now, but thank you for your remarks. It was a privilege to hear from you. There was just one comment you made, and it wasn't an overarching comment, but it piqued my interest. You stated that about 10, 15 years ago, businesses wouldn't have spent a moment thinking about entering into partnership with Indigenous communities. And I'm just intrigued from your own vantage point, what are the conditions that have changed? Is it because businesses are catching the wind of reconciliation, which I think might be a bit of a more romantic view of things, or is it because they see that there's opportunities in terms of maturing situations within Indigenous communities that allows them to move forward and to seize economic opportunities? Just wanted to drill down on that one observation you made. Thank you.
Well, when I said like 15 years ago, that would not have been, wouldn't have happened 15 years ago. I think it's because of the growth. Indigenous peoples have not been just sitting still waiting. They have been doing a lot on their own. And moving ahead on their own, and it's not all done by the hierarchy of leadership. It's sometimes people are out there working, they understand, and and this is what I was talking about when I talked about educating and talking to people and talking about partnerships, talking about that we are capable and we have a lot of expertise and we have a lot to contribute, and this has taken place slowly, 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 but more so, more and more things are opening up with organizations like this one here, and that are opening the doors even wider, and to allow for corporations and for others to know that here is a what can we call it, that's been left out for so long. You know, that we could have been a part of the building, because Indian affairs, and this is probably where the Indian Act has been sort of a barrier. Because it was there administering, it was as if there was nothing that Indian people, status Indian people, I'll call them, you know, indigenous people, could do, because there were barriers within the Act itself, and so they were sort of ignored by corporations because there were these barriers within the Act that precluded them from getting into partnerships and by doing business with them. We weren't seen as good business partners because the Indian Act was always there with all kinds of barriers. Now that's being removed, and a lot of it has been done by innovative thinking by I'll say the bands themselves to get away from that. And that's what I mean. You can't wait for something to happen, for legislation to change, to empower you to go ahead and begin moving yourself to do some of that. So the education hasn't, there's all of the, there's been a lot of, I'll use the term, I guess, education that's been going on by a lot of people, and to show that we are advancing and we're ready and getting ready and we are ready. I don't know if that answered your question.
Any more questions? Well, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Really do appreciate this, and it's very insightful in regards to the next steps. Actually, I want to ask one question.
Okay.
What would be the next steps? Like, obviously, INAC, the solution of INAC. In your vision, what would you see the next step being for them, for the government?
For the government?
For the relationship to move forward.
Well, you know, I just got done talking, and I just said that I don't think my vision and what I think it should be, I think it's important to know what the people think, what it should be. Yeah. And this is what I'm trying to impress upon on the people. You know, it's when I started this work, even with the work that I'm doing now here with the Mi'kmaq, we went to the people because we have to work from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. Top down does not work. It hasn't worked, never has. But we have to work from the bottom up, from what we believe, what our visions are, and what our thoughts are. So I'm waiting to hear, and I have my own, but my vision is just keep going. Don't stop. The federal government, just because they've made this change, they can't stop listening and think they've done it all, because they've just started. There's a lot to be done. There's an awful lot to be done. But as they do it, they have to make sure that Indigenous people are the ones that are coming to them and giving them advice and giving them recommendations on how, and it's not going to be the same, like I said. what's going to come from Manitoba and what's going to come from Nova Scotia, it's going to be totally different.
That's
We have
excellent.
oceans, they don't.
Thank you so much.
Okay.